At the close of World War II, the world was irrevocably altered. While the victors celebrated the downfall of the Axis powers, there were countless pockets of the war, small battles and forgotten corners, where the true impact of the conflict had yet to be realized. One such corner was a remote battalion of soldiers, cut off from their homeland and stranded in a foreign land that seemed to have little regard for them. The war had moved on, and so had the world. These men, once proud warriors, now faced the grim reality of abandonment. The battalion had been left behind during one of the most chaotic stages of the war. In the midst of shifting alliances and the unpredictability of global warfare, they were effectively forgotten. Their supply lines had been severed, and communication with their home country had become nothing more than a distant hope. They had been stationed far from the front lines, in a desolate part of a country that had already been ravaged by conflict. But even in the best of times, this region had been one of extreme hardship, a place where survival itself was a battle. Now, with the war's momentum shifting and the home front preoccupied with larger concerns, these soldiers were left to face a desperate future. Months passed, and what had once been a well-oiled military machine began to show signs of decay. The food rations, once a dependable lifeline, dwindled to nothing. The soldiers' bodies began to break down, their spirits crushed under the weight of a slow, suffocating hunger that gnawed at their every thought. The mornings came with the desperate hope that some form of rescue might arrive, but as the weeks turned into months, and then the months into years, those hopes began to wither. The daily struggle for survival became the battalion's primary focus. What had once been a proud, disciplined group of soldiers, unified by a single purpose, was now a ragtag collection of men who fought not for glory, but for basic survival. Some of the officers who had once been symbols of strength and leadership had begun to lose their resolve, their once strong voices now weary and hollow. They had no answers, no solutions, just the grim knowledge that they were trapped in a forgotten limbo. Each day brought a new obstacle, a new challenge that seemed insurmountable. In their isolation, the soldiers began to feel like ghosts, not just to the outside world, but to their own country. They had been left behind in the tide of history, swept away in the wake of a war that had moved on without them. They heard rumors of victories, of tactical movements that seemed to make their own battle irrelevant. They heard news of alliances and treaties, of bombings and new fronts, but none of that seemed to reach them. In the barren wasteland they inhabited, no one cared about them. It was as though they no longer existed in the eyes of the world. Their uniforms, once crisp and proud, had become ragged and torn, stained by the dirt and sweat of months, if not years, of harsh survival. The men had grown thinner, their faces hollow from malnutrition, their eyes dull from the strain of constant fear and hopelessness. Disease, too, had begun to take its toll. Without proper medical care, basic injuries festered into debilitating illnesses, and the once proud battalion began to wither under the combined weight of time, hunger, and sickness. As the days stretched on, the soldiers' morale reached its breaking point. It became evident that no help was coming. The belief that they had been forgotten was no longer just a nagging suspicion, it was an undeniable truth. The idea that their government, their leaders, had abandoned them, had given up on them, was a bitter pill to swallow. In the midst of all this, a quiet anger began to build. The men resented not just the abandonment, but the helplessness that had been forced upon them. They resented the larger forces of the war that had determined their fate without any regard for their lives. And yet, amid this despair, there was a flicker of something else. It wasn't hope in the traditional sense, but a deep, stubborn resolve to survive against all odds. Some of the soldiers began to whisper among themselves about escaping, about breaking out of their prison. They spoke of making their way back to civilization, of finding any way out of the wilderness that had swallowed them whole. But even these dreams of escape were laced with the grim reality of their situation. They were too weak to fight their way out. Even if they tried, the very landscape itself seemed to conspire against them. It was a feeling that they had come to know all too well. The world was indifferent to their suffering. As the months dragged on, food became an even rarer commodity. The soldiers grew desperate, scavenging whatever they could find, roots, wild berries, anything that could fill their stomachs, if only for a moment. They traded what little they had for supplies, but the bartering system was unreliable. Sometimes they went days without a real meal, and the pangs of hunger became a constant companion. There were moments when it seemed as though the battalion was simply waiting for death, resigned to their fate, each man only a step away from the edge. It was during one particularly harrowing period, when supplies were all but exhausted, that a strange sense of unity began to form among the soldiers. Perhaps it was born out of the necessity of survival, or perhaps it was the result of the long months of isolation, but they began to lean on one another in ways they hadn't before. The bond of comradeship that had initially united them in their mission became the only thing they could rely on now. They shared what little food they had, helped one another with wounds, and spoke of their families and homes, though they all knew in their hearts that they would never return. For some, the bonds that had been formed in battle became a cruel irony. They had fought together once with a sense of purpose, believing that they were working toward something greater. But now, they fought for nothing more than survival. There were no grand ideals, no noble cause. They were simply men alone in the world, struggling to stay alive. It was in this grim environment that the first signs of change came, though none of the soldiers could have predicted it. As they sat huddled around their meager fires one evening, the distant rumble of vehicles broke the silence. At first, they thought it was a trick of the mind, a fantasy brought on by the crushing weight of hunger and despair. But as the sound grew louder, hope and fear began to stir within them. Could it be that they were finally being found? Or was it another enemy, ready to finish what the war had started? The men held their breath, straining to hear. The rumble grew louder, and then, like a vision from a dream, a convoy appeared on the horizon. British vehicles, their insignia unmistakable, came into view, kicking up dust as they approached the battalion's position. The soldiers, weak and skeletal from months of deprivation, stood frozen, unable to believe their eyes. It was as if the world had finally remembered them, but what would this encounter mean? Was it rescue, or something more? The convoy pulled to a stop, and the first British soldiers disembarked. In that moment, the men of the forgotten battalion knew that their lives were about to change. They didn't know how or in what way, but they knew that they were no longer invisible. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were seen. The arrival of the British convoy was nothing short of miraculous, or so it seemed at first. As the dust settled and the convoy's vehicles came to a halt, the men of the forgotten battalion stood motionless, caught in a mix of disbelief and hesitation. After months, if not years, of enduring isolation, of watching the world move on without them, this unexpected appearance felt like a dream, something too good to be true. They were, at once, hesitant and hopeful, unsure whether this was the answer to their long-held desperation, or yet another cruel twist of fate. The British soldiers, dressed in their recognizable uniforms, moved swiftly but cautiously, assessing the situation as they surveyed the scene before them. Their faces, though marked by the fatigue of war, held an unmistakable air of purpose. They weren't just here to deliver aid, they were here with something far more complex in mind. As they disembarked from their vehicles and began to move toward the battalion's ragtag group of survivors, the men stood in silence. There was no applause, no cheers of joy, only a quiet understanding that something significant was unfolding before them. To the battalion, these British soldiers were not just saviors, they were a sign, a signal that they were not forgotten. The British brought with them food, the likes of which the men had not seen in months. Cans of preserved meat, fresh water, and packets of biscuits, seemingly ordinary provisions, were met with a profound sense of gratitude. These were not just meals to sustain them, they were a lifeline, a testament to the fact that someone, somewhere, still cared. For the first time in so long, the gnawing hunger that had become their constant companion began to ebb away. The battalion's men ate ravenously, as if their bodies had forgotten what it was like to be nourished. And as they ate, a strange camaraderie began to form between them and their British counterparts. For a brief moment, the language of war, the tension that had defined so many of their lives, seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the simple and profound act of sharing a meal. But even as the soldiers ate, the weight of the moment lingered. There was no easy explanation for why the British had come. The battalion's men could only speculate. Had the British found them by accident? Was this part of some larger strategy, an effort to reassert control over a forgotten region? Or, perhaps, was it a mere act of kindness, an extension of humanity in a time when such gestures were rare? The questions hung heavy in the air, unanswered, as the men ate and spoke with their visitors. There was an unmistakable tension beneath the surface of the pleasantries exchanged. Neither side fully trusted the other, but both were united by a shared need: survival. As the days went on and the British soldiers made their presence felt more strongly, the battalion's men began to realize that this visit was no accident. It was not just a random act of mercy, nor was it the product of sheer goodwill. The British soldiers had a clear purpose, and it soon became apparent that the men of the battalion were, in some ways, more than just people in need. They were part of something far larger. The British were there to gather intelligence, to assess the condition of the soldiers, and, perhaps most importantly, to begin the slow process of recruitment. This realization came gradually, as subtle hints and offhand comments dropped by the British soldiers began to take root in the minds of the battalion's men. What had initially been perceived as a simple aid mission began to take on a different character. The British were not just feeding and clothing them, they were shaping the men into something new, something they hadn't fully understood at first. The soldiers had begun to grasp that they were not merely being rescued, they were being cultivated for a greater purpose. The battalion's leaders, some of whom had once been confident and authoritative, found themselves torn between gratitude and suspicion. On one hand, the British soldiers had brought them food, medicine, and supplies, the very things that had kept them alive for months. But on the other hand, the terms of this so-called rescue began to feel like something else entirely. The battalion had never been asked for their consent. No one had asked whether they wanted to be a part of the British effort, nor had anyone bothered to explain the larger motives behind these visits. The more they were visited, the clearer it became. These were not just charity missions, but strategic maneuvers in a larger game of power and control. For the men of the battalion, the question soon became one of moral choice. Should they accept the aid, knowing that it might come with a hidden price? Or should they reject it, as some had suggested, and continue their struggle alone, no matter how impossible that might seem? These questions were not abstract. They were rooted in the very fabric of the soldiers' daily lives. The simple act of receiving a meal from the British was now loaded with the awareness that they were being drawn into a larger narrative, one that had little to do with their original cause and everything to do with survival within the context of a new power dynamic. The men of the battalion had once believed in the nobility of their mission. They had been soldiers for a greater cause, fighting not just for their country but for the ideals that had once defined their nation. Now that mission felt distant and fractured. They had been left behind, forgotten, and yet here they were, presented with the tantalizing offer of survival at the hands of a foreign power. The notion of allegiance was no longer as simple as it had once been. The battalion had been abandoned by their own, and now they were being courted by another. But even as the battalion wrestled with these larger moral questions, the immediate needs of survival continued to take precedence. The British visits continued, and with each one, the soldiers became increasingly dependent on their visitors. It wasn't just the physical provisions that they were receiving, it was the hope that these visits represented. They had gone from being abandoned and forgotten to being acknowledged and cared for. The visits became a ritual of sorts, a lifeline that the men came to rely on, not just for food and supplies, but for the promise of something more. It was as if, in the act of receiving, they were once again being woven into the fabric of a world that had left them behind. But with this new dependence came new tensions. There were some within the battalion who began to see the British as their only hope, as the saviors who had brought them back from the brink of oblivion. They began to trust the British, seeing them not just as military allies, but as benevolent figures who had restored a sense of purpose to their lives. Others, however, were more skeptical. They saw the British as opportunistic, using the battalion as pawns in a larger strategic game. These men began to question the true motives behind the visits. Were they really here to help, or was there something more sinister at play? As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the British soldiers' visits became more frequent. They brought more supplies, and in turn, the battalion's men began to feel a sense of connection, not just to the British soldiers, but to the world outside their small, forgotten corner of the war. The visits began to feel like a return to some semblance of normalcy, a return to a world where survival no longer seemed like the sole focus of existence. The soldiers began to talk about the future, about what might come next. For the first time in a long while, they began to imagine a world beyond the confines of their isolation. But as the battalion's dependence on the British grew, so too did the complexity of their situation. The men began to realize that they could never return to the life they had known before. Whatever future they might have would be defined by the choices they made now. And so, with each new visit, the stakes grew higher. The question of survival was no longer just about food or shelter, it was about what they were willing to give in exchange for that survival. It was about loyalty, about identity, and about the price of a future shaped by forces they could not fully understand. In the quiet moments of reflection, the soldiers knew that they had been changed forever. But whether they would ultimately be rescued or consumed by the very forces that had once abandoned them remained to be seen. The days following the initial British visit blurred together, each one fading into the next like the thin thread of a forgotten dream. The battalion, once desperate and isolated, had begun to change. At first, they couldn't quite understand it, this feeling of being tethered to something larger than themselves, yet smaller than the world they had once known. The British visits had initially seemed like isolated events, strange occurrences that came and went with little consequence. But over time, the visits grew more frequent, and something began to shift in the battalion's understanding of their role in the broader conflict. They were no longer just a forgotten group of soldiers trapped in a liminal space. They were becoming something else, something that neither they nor the British had anticipated. The British soldiers, while providing aid, also brought with them a sense of order and discipline that was both a comfort and a reminder of the world beyond their remote outpost. The men of the battalion had lived in a world defined by chaos for so long that the structured presence of the British felt almost surreal. They saw it as a beacon of hope, something solid in a world that had felt as though it was falling apart. Yet, it also had a more insidious effect. It slowly began to reshape the battalion's understanding of their place in the war. The first time the British soldiers arrived again, it was with a sense of purpose that the battalion had not yet seen. Their interactions were more organized, more deliberate. They brought more supplies, yes, but they also brought something else: instructions. They began to lay the groundwork for a new kind of engagement, one that transcended mere survival. The British officers started to speak of strategy, of new fronts in the war, and of potential alliances. They were not just delivering aid, they were slowly introducing the battalion to a larger world, one that they had once been a part of, but had now become distanced from. It was in these conversations that the men of the battalion began to understand the true nature of their predicament. They had thought, at first, that the British were there purely out of humanitarian concern, that their motives were rooted in kindness and compassion. But slowly, it became apparent that the British had come with more than just food and medicine. They had come with a purpose that was tied not just to the well-being of the soldiers, but to the larger goals of the British war effort. For some of the men, this was a difficult pill to swallow. They had been abandoned by their own, left to rot in the wilderness, forgotten by the world. And now, here were these British soldiers, showing up as if they had all the answers, providing aid and making promises of a future that felt both unfamiliar and fraught with uncertainty. The soldiers began to talk amongst themselves, questioning the true nature of the British visits. Some saw them as a lifeline, a much-needed intervention in a world that had otherwise left them behind. Others saw them as something darker, an attempt to manipulate their loyalty, to draw them into the British sphere of influence. The British officers, for their part, were careful with their words. They spoke of honor, of shared goals, and of a future in which the battalion could be reintegrated into the larger war effort. They offered assurances not just of survival, but of a return to purpose. They painted a picture of what could be, a world where the battalion was no longer stranded, forgotten, but instead a valued part of the greater war effort. They spoke of the end of the war, of the new world that would emerge once the Axis powers were defeated. And in those words, the battalion saw a glimmer of hope. It was a hope that had long been absent from their lives, replaced instead by the grim reality of daily survival. But that hope was tinged with uncertainty. As the British continued to visit, the battalion's men grew increasingly divided. Some embraced the idea of cooperation, seeing the British as their saviors, the only force capable of pulling them out of their misery. They began to believe in the possibility of a new future, one in which they would no longer be isolated and forgotten. They began to talk of rejoining the war effort, of returning to their homes as heroes, having fought alongside the British to help end the war. They saw these visits as the first steps toward redemption, toward returning to a world that had once made sense to them. But others within the battalion were more suspicious. They had grown wary of the British presence, seeing it as something more than just a gesture of kindness. To them, the British were no different from the larger forces of the war that had abandoned them in the first place. They believed that the British were not here to help them, but to use them. They spoke of loyalty and betrayal, of being pawns in a larger geopolitical game. To them, the British were not the solution, they were just another part of the problem. They questioned the promises of a better future, wondering if they were simply being manipulated into serving someone else's agenda. The division within the battalion became palpable. As the British returned, time and time again, the men grew more and more entrenched in their positions. On one side, there were those who believed in the promise of reintegration, of fighting once more for something larger than themselves. They saw the British as the key to unlocking a future, a return to normalcy. On the other side, there were those who saw the British as no different from the enemy they had once fought against, a foreign power that was using them to further its own goals. The men on this side felt betrayed by their own government, and they were now reluctant to trust anyone, even those who had brought them food and water. For the British soldiers, this growing division was both a challenge and a reminder of the complexities of their mission. They had come to offer aid, to help a group of soldiers who had been left behind, forgotten by the world. But they were now finding that their presence was not without consequences. The battalion's men, though grateful for the provisions, were not easily swayed. The British soldiers were not seen as unquestioned saviors, they were seen as part of the complicated web of geopolitics that had led to their isolation in the first place. They had come to provide assistance, but in doing so, they had unknowingly become a source of division. It was during this time that the battalion's leaders began to realize that the visits were not just about survival, they were about shaping the future. The British were not just interested in feeding them and providing medical aid, they were interested in turning the battalion into something else, something more strategic. Slowly but surely, the officers began to speak of loyalty, of joining forces with the British in a broader war effort. They talked of reinforcements, of fighting on new fronts, and of taking part in a global strategy that was larger than anything the battalion had ever known. The idea of loyalty was complicated. To the soldiers, loyalty had once been a clear and unquestionable concept. They had been loyal to their country, to their leaders, and to one another. But now, that loyalty was being tested in ways they had never imagined. Could they be loyal to the British, a foreign power, in exchange for survival? Could they, in good conscience, align themselves with the very forces that had abandoned them? The question of loyalty became the battalion's central struggle, one that could not be answered simply or easily. The men found themselves at a crossroads, torn between survival and principle, between a future with the British and a future without them. The British soldiers, for their part, continued their visits, though they were increasingly aware of the growing tension among the battalion's men. They tried to quell the unrest with reassurances and promises, but these efforts were met with varying degrees of acceptance. Some of the soldiers responded enthusiastically, grateful for the opportunity to rejoin the war effort, to fight once more for a cause they could believe in. Others remained skeptical, seeing the British as nothing more than the latest force to enter their lives with promises of a better future that seemed too distant to believe in. As the visits continued, the battalion's men slowly began to realize that they were not just receiving food and supplies, they were receiving the chance to reshape their own destiny. They had been abandoned, forgotten, and now they were being given the opportunity to choose what came next. But this new opportunity was fraught with moral complications, as they had to weigh the value of survival against their own sense of identity and loyalty. They had been cut off from the world for so long that they had forgotten what it meant to be a part of something larger. The British had offered them that chance, but in doing so, they had also presented them with a choice: to continue on the path of survival, no matter the cost, or to reject this new alliance and remain loyal to a past that no longer existed. The battalion's men knew that the choice would not be an easy one. But as the British visits continued, they began to understand that the stakes were much higher than just survival. They were about who they would become in the process. The division within the battalion deepened, and the question of what it meant to be a soldier, to be loyal, became the heart of their struggle. And as the British soldiers continued to return, bringing with them the promise of a future that could either save or destroy them, the battalion's fate hung in the balance. As the British continued their regular visits, the men of the forgotten battalion began to feel the weight of their situation more acutely than ever before. What had once been a simple lifeline, food, water, and medicine, had gradually transformed into something far more complex, laden with implications they had not yet fully comprehended. The arrival of each British convoy brought with it more than just material aid. It carried an unspoken promise, one that was both reassuring and unsettling. Slowly, through these interactions, the battalion's men began to grasp the true cost of their situation. They weren't just being rescued, they were being drawn into a larger, far more complicated game, one that would shape their futures in ways they couldn't yet fathom. The first, innocent perception of the British presence. Those early days when the soldiers had believed they were receiving aid out of a pure sense of humanity, now seemed naive. As the British officers continued to speak of alliances and shared goals, of the grand strategy of the war, the battalion's men began to realize that their predicament was not as accidental as it had seemed. They had been abandoned by their own country, left to rot in a corner of the world where no one cared. But the British, far from being mere benevolent strangers, had come with a specific, calculated purpose. The realization came slowly, seeping into their minds like the steady drip of water eroding stone. The men had always known, deep down, that they were not the focus of any grand strategy, that they were simply pawns in a much larger war. But now they began to see that they were not being left to perish. Instead, they were being re-engaged, repurposed for a different role altogether. The British weren't just rescuing them, they were incorporating them into their own war plans. They weren't simply delivering aid, they were preparing the battalion for something more. And with that realization came the unsettling sense that their survival came with strings attached. The battalion's leaders, especially those who had once been confident in their mission and their purpose, began to feel the gnawing dissonance between the soldier they had been and the soldier they were being asked to become. The British were offering them a new chance. Yes, a chance to be a part of the war effort again, to re-enter the fight for freedom and justice that had once been the reason they donned their uniforms. But in doing so, the battalion's men were being drawn into a web of alliances, political maneuverings, and power struggles that went far beyond their understanding. The promise of reintegration into the global war effort was seductive, but it came with an unspoken price. The battalion was no longer just a forgotten group of soldiers, they were now part of a larger strategy, and their actions, their loyalty, would have consequences. As the battalion's men processed this new reality, the division within their ranks grew ever more pronounced. There were some who, despite the moral ambiguity of their situation, embraced the idea of joining the British cause. To them, survival had become paramount. The years of isolation, of suffering, had worn away at their once strong sense of loyalty to their homeland. What did it matter, they reasoned, who they fought for as long as they fought for something? The British had come when no one else had, and they were offering them a future beyond mere survival, beyond the daily struggle of scavenging and avoiding death. They began to see the British not just as allies, but as redeemers, as those who could restore them to the world they had lost. For others, however, the arrival of the British soldiers stirred something far darker, a sense of betrayal that they could not shake. They had fought once, under the banner of their own country, believing in its ideals and its promises. But now, those promises felt like hollow lies. They had been abandoned, forgotten in the wilderness, and now they were being asked to join a cause that had nothing to do with the reasons they had once enlisted. The British had arrived not to save them out of goodwill, but to use them. To these men, the British were no different from the Axis forces they had once fought against, powerful, distant, and unconcerned with the lives of the soldiers they manipulated. They were just another foreign power, seeking to exploit the battalion's desperation for their own purposes. The battalion's leaders found themselves caught in the crossfire of these conflicting ideologies. Some began to advocate for full cooperation with the British, seeing it as the only path to survival, while others began to speak of rebellion, of refusing to be drawn into a war that had long since abandoned them. But even as the debate raged, there was one undeniable fact that none could ignore: their future was no longer in their own hands. They were pawns in a game much larger than their own survival, and the more they interacted with the British, the more they understood just how deeply they were entangled in that game. The British officers, for their part, were well aware of the battalion's growing divisions. They had expected resistance, of course. They knew that the men they were trying to recruit were not just soldiers. They were people with their own histories, their own allegiances, and their own wounds. The officers had come prepared to deal with those divisions, to win the men over with promises of glory, of honor, and of a return to purpose. But even they were beginning to understand that their mission was not as straightforward as they had originally thought. The battalion was no longer simply a group of soldiers to be saved. It was a group of people to be convinced, each with their own idea of what survival, loyalty, and honor meant. But the British had a strategy, and they were determined to see it through. They continued to visit the battalion regularly, bringing supplies and offering their assistance, but they also began to push harder, urging the soldiers to commit to the cause. They spoke of the larger war effort, of the global fight for freedom, and of the role the battalion could play in that fight. They spoke of the future, of a world after the war, and of the dignity that could come with choosing the right side. The battalion, they said, had the opportunity to be a part of something far greater than themselves. It was a tempting offer, especially for those whose spirits had been broken by years of isolation and deprivation. The British officers were skilled in their manipulation, but they were also genuine in their belief that the battalion could help turn the tide of the war. They understood that the soldiers' loyalty was in question, but they also understood the power of hope, the power of offering something better than what had come before. And they believed that the men of the battalion, once shown the path to a new purpose, would take it. The officers were not just offering survival, they were offering a future. But as the battalion's men struggled to reconcile their old loyalties with the new promises, they began to see that the future the British were offering came with a different set of burdens. The internal conflict reached a boiling point one evening when a group of the battalion's leaders, divided over the decision of whether to accept the British offer, gathered for a tense discussion. The air was thick with tension as the men argued, each side digging in their heels. Some believed that joining the British cause was the only way to reclaim their honor, to once again become part of the world they had been so brutally torn from. Others saw it as an ultimate betrayal, a final concession to the forces that had abandoned them. As the arguments grew more heated, it became clear that there was no simple answer, no clear path forward. For the men of the battalion, the question of loyalty had become a question of identity. Who were they now? And more importantly, who did they want to become? As the debate raged on, the British officers, sensing the growing unrest, began to apply more pressure. They promised reinforcements, more supplies, and a chance to regain some measure of control over their own futures. But in doing so, they also made it clear that the battalion's cooperation was no longer optional. They were being drawn deeper into the web of global politics, and the more they resisted, the more they realized that their survival depended on accepting the reality of their situation. The battalion's men were beginning to realize that their fate was no longer their own. The British had not just come to help, they had come to shape them, to turn them into something else. The soldiers had been abandoned once, left to die in a forgotten corner of the world, but now they were being offered a new chance. The price of that chance was their loyalty. And as the battalion's men continued to wrestle with their decision, the full weight of their predicament settled on them. They were no longer just soldiers in a forgotten war, they were pieces in a much larger game, and every decision they made now would echo far beyond their small corner of the conflict. As the days stretched into weeks, the battalion's internal division deepened. The men who had once been united by their struggle for survival now found themselves at odds. their thoughts and loyalties torn in opposite directions. The British, with their promise of a new purpose and the temptation of a future beyond mere existence, had changed the dynamic of the battalion. What had started as a seemingly simple offer of aid had become a moral dilemma of the highest order. Could the soldiers accept the help they so desperately needed without compromising their honor? Could they align themselves with a foreign power, a power that had not just rescued them but now sought to mold them into something else entirely? The battalion's leaders found themselves torn, unable to provide clear guidance to the men who looked to them for direction.